Today we are looking at potential rumours of a new Blackmagic Pocket 6K camera and whether it's going to have an L mount, as well as a wish list of the features that I hope this new camera will have. Now I will admit I am a little bit late to the game when it comes to talking about the rumours of this new camera. There hasn't really been anything new in the last month, but if you haven't heard about it already, there are rumours it's going to be using L mount, and well, this seems pretty likely and probably the most obvious option out of all the mirrorless mounts that Blackmagic could go for. Working with some of the smaller manufacturers like Panasonic and Sigma does just make a lot of sense. There's less competition going on there. They're probably better to work together and really make the L mount a serious competition to RF and E mount. Now the rumours are that it's going to have the same sensor as the Blackmagic Pocket 6K, the 6K Pro like the one here, and of course the G2, which is a bit of a disappointment if that is the case, as it's been a while now. We've had this sensor for a long time. It's a great sensor. It produces some amazing results, still produces some amazing results, but certainly I'd like to see some advancements, and I'm a bit worried that perhaps we've hit the limitations of what this sensor can truly do. Now apparently there will be improved frame rates, up to 75 frames per second in 6K. And that's pretty impressive if they manage to squeeze out that extra frame rate out of this sensor. It's probably more to do with the processor upgrade perhaps that's going to be giving us that rather than any other big major changes. The final rumour we have heard about this camera is the fact that it's going to be a smaller body design, still with a fairly large screen on the back, but it's going to be much more the shape of a Sony FX3. So it's going to be much more boxy, it's going to have mounting points, and hopefully a bit more solid. It's probably not going to be as small as an FX3. I think that would be a hard achievement for Blackmagic to be able to do, especially if they want to keep a large, big touchscreen on the back. But certainly having something that's a bit smaller is going to be far more useful when working on a gimbal. So that's what the rumours are, and they all sound pretty realistic. I must admit I'd be slightly disappointed if we're not seeing an upgraded sensor, mainly for a few reasons that I'll get into now, and here's my wish list that I hope the next Blackmagic camera is going to have. First off, I'd love to see open gate on a camera like this. Now of course the sensor that is in there right now, that is already being used to its full extent. The entire sensor is used for the 6K image. However, I'd like to see some new shapes of sensors being used. We've seen Panasonic take advantage of their 3x2 sensor in the S5 Mark II, and the fact that you can shoot open gate 6K in there, which just gives you that little bit extra height above and below. However, I really think now, as we're moving forward, we should be seeing square sensors in cameras. Why not? Let's give us a nice square sensor in there and just then pick the shape and resolution that you need depending on the job that you're going ahead and doing. I do hope that they stick with 6K. I don't really want more resolution, larger file sizes. I already find it big enough. I find that for a lot of shoots, I prefer to go for the Sony's or the Canon camera just purely because the file sizes are more manageable. You know, having a compressed codec in there is very useful. And in fact, that's something I'd like to see also in the Blackmagic Pocket 6K G3 or whatever we're calling it, is a more compressed option available, just some sort of H.264 or H.265, like we see actually in their Ursa Broadcast G2. That's incredibly handy when you don't need all the flexibility of RAW. Perhaps you're just doing a very simple interview that just needs to be sent to a client very quickly, or it doesn't need heavy grading and it's maybe a very controlled environment. Well then why not save the space and record in H.265 instead, like we've already seen on other cameras. I would of course like to see higher frame rates, and if the rumours are true, we are going to get that. Although 75 is nice, it's not as much as I was hoping we would see. I think now we'd probably expect 100 frames. Speaking more of that sensor then, perhaps the answer would be is if they're using a sensor that they've developed themselves, like they did on the Blackmagic Ursa 12K, where it can actually switch between resolutions and still use the entire sensor. That is really impressive tech. I'd like to see that come in on a camera like the 6K. The final thing about the sensor I want to talk about is the rolling shutter. It isn't that great on this camera. It's certainly better if you shoot 5.7K, but it is frustrating and you do get a lot of jello in certain situations. For me, it's not been too bad. For a lot of things that I shoot, it's been okay. But certainly if you did sport and things, I would totally recommend people go for the FX3 over this camera in that type of shooting, because you would start really noticing it then. Hopefully with a higher refreshing sensor, we're going to see much better rolling shutter in a future camera. I think that's quite important now. Certainly if you're going to go down the argument of this as being a cinema camera, then it should have minimal rolling shutter. One thing I really don't want them to take away from a future camera is the large bright screen. Okay, make it maybe a bit smaller to fit the size of the camera that they're going to make it, so that it can fit on a gimbal easier. But please don't massively sacrifice it. Don't give us a tiny screen. Don't go back to like what all the competition are doing. That's one thing this camera does way better than anything else. Still, after all this time, it's still got the biggest and far brightest screen of any camera out there. Yes, it had its issues when it first came out, before you had the option to be able to calibrate it, but ever since then, it's been an amazing screen to use, and to have that built into the camera is so useful. It means you don't need to use an external monitor unless you really need to use the camera at different angles. The battery life is something that I hope we really do see an improvement on. It's certainly got a lot better when they switched to using the NP batteries over the Canon batteries in the past. That was a bad choice, and it's certainly a big improvement. But even the Sony MPF batteries, they're okay, but they are quite old now. They're not the highest capacity considering their size, they're not particularly fast at charging, and they're relatively large still. And certainly if they're going to make the body smaller, I think they're going to need to find a way of fitting a smaller, more efficient battery that can go inside it, that hopefully will see us get better battery life. I also hope they don't get rid of ND filters inside this camera. It is so awesome. This is pretty much the smallest camera you can buy in a professional capacity anyway, that does have built-in NDs, and it's so useful. Now, I do wish that they improve them, because although they're good, when you go to the max strength ND and you're combining them all together, you do see quite a color shift, and that can be quite frustrating when you come to color grading. Luckily, the RAW does help a lot here, but it'd be nice if it was consistent throughout the range, like you see on other cameras like the C70. We are unlikely to see anything like a stabilized sensor in one of these cameras, and I'm not going to even try and argue the case for putting one in there. I'd love it if it did have one, but I wouldn't want to sacrifice the ND filters, and actually the gyro stabilization works pretty well. It's clever tech, and if they keep working on that and the integration with DaVinci Resolve, then I don't think it's a major issue. Obviously, I'd love to see Panasonic sensor tech in here with incredible stabilization, but perhaps that is just dreaming a bit too far when it comes to the next camera from Blackmagic. Finally, and I know this is also quite a long shot, but I really hope we get to see in the next camera, or at least at some point, autofocus in a Blackmagic pocket camera. I know people are going to argue, it's a cinema camera, you don't need autofocus. Well, I don't think that's true. In fact, I've done a whole video on when you should and shouldn't use autofocus in a professional environment, so make sure you check out that video. As I explained, there are plenty of examples where autofocus is incredibly useful and you should be using it on professional shoots. I think now with the competition that's out there, cinema cameras that are providing great autofocus, Blackmagic do need to find a way of catching up and adding it to their next camera.